This is part one of an essay that I wrote for my publisher, my primary publisher, Bain Enterprises. And it's officially Principles of Organization for War and Organizing for War in the Carrera-verse. In fact, it's more about organizing for war generally, although it's going to relate to the Carrera-verse quite a bit. The Carrera-verse is a fairly large and lengthy series of science fiction, but as much military and social philosophy as anything else that I've written for Bain. The next volume of which is coming out 6 November on Kindle and 13 November in hardback, allegedly. All I'm going to do is give you the first part of this essay that I wrote, and you can find the rest online, I'm sure, at about that time. So, part one, introduction. In the history of the Carrera-verse and what eventually became the Timocratic Republic of Balboa, there are 6 models of organization seen. The first of these was the creation model, by which the main character, Patricio Carrera, built out of previously defeated and disbanded scraps of the Balboan armed forces the second model, a brigade of auxiliaries to wage conventional war in order to begin to avenge the murders of his wife and children, as well as to earn money to continue that program of revenge. The second model was Flux and Little Butt, wherein the Legio del Cid expanded from that single brigade-sized organization to the third model, a corps-sized force able to keep one legion, their name for division, in action and counterinsurgency, continuously. The third model was the rapid ad hoc reorganization of the corps to once again fight a more or less conventional war, this time to reinvade the fictional state of Pastia and retrieve the waning fortunes of the alliance there, before reverting back to the third model. The fourth model was a still expanding reversion to the third. The fifth, following the taking over of the nation, was the expansion of the corps to a national defense organization the size of a large multi-corps army, capable of waging total war in defense of the nation against the likely enemies, the Tauran Union and the Zhong Empire, predictably aided by the United Earth Peace Fleet, as well as waging war in Balboa's near abroad, along with a very limited ability to wage war, both kinetic and propaganda / mimetic war anywhere on the planet of Terra Nova. The fifth model itself can be subdivided into 2 further models, 5A, the unmobilized, largely hidden, and in part only diplomatically valid nation in arms, and 5B, the fully mobilized force with allies. That could use a little explanation when you can't read it in front of you. Basically, the man created a training organization from which he created a deployable maneuver brigade, from which he raised in several steps a corps-sized force, which he reorganized at one point in time to wage conventional rather than counterinsurgency warfare, and to which he went back before changing it to a nation in arms with which he was capable of and did in fact wage war against people who outnumbered and out-treasured him by orders of magnitude. Okay, back to the reading. Although I don't think it's anywhere stated within the series, in building the different models, Carrera was either consciously adhering to or consciously violating certain long-standing, albeit often unstated, principles of military organization. So what are some of those principles of organization? This is a non-exhaustive list. Number 1, social cohesion. Organize your sub-organizations for maximum feasible affection and group emotional attachment within and among the officers and men. 2, flexibility in maneuver. Organize the number of subunits to give options to allow left and right, but also forward and rear. And though I didn't say so, also to allow the ability to mass, but that comes a little later. 3, span of control. Organize with no more subunits than the man responsible can supervise in action and pre-action, no more than he can professionally develop, rate, and know, so that the leadership can retain integrity and personal honor. If you read the whole essay, once Bain puts it out, you'll find some examples where, at least one big example, where we violated that pretty badly. And in fact, our current UEX-UEY is a violation of that principle. UEX-UEY are brigade combat teams. Combined arms. Organized to achieve and employ combined arms. There are reasons for that you'll be able to read later on. Purity. Organized so that the commander or leader knows and understands every job of his subordinates. Discipline. Organized to ensure that all ranks are supervised and improper conduct identified and corrected or punished. 7. Rest. Organized to relieve and allow rest for the sub-organizations and the men who comprise them. 8. Leadership. Organized to make it easily and instantly recognizable who is responsible and in charge. Organized to keep leadership quality high. 9. Simplicity. Do not add needless complexity. Balance necessary complexity. 10. Logistics. Organized for effective logistics support. 11. Attrition. Organized for anti-fragility and ability to endure losses. 12. Mass. Already mentioned once. Organized to allow massing of combat power and especially to give artillery, quote, maximum feasible centralized control, which is how artillery creates mass or uses mass. Support. Organized for supporting arms to provide support. I'm referring there to things like engineers, air defense, and artillery too, not logistics. You could perhaps call this combat support. 14. Range and weapons effects. Organized to place weapons at the right echelon, and there are a couple of rules to that. 15. Environment. Organized to meet the demands of the physical environment in which you will wage war. 16. Specialization. Organized to avoid over-specialization and to gain appropriate specialization. 17. State circumstances. In organizing, remember the industrial population and other resource limits of the state and of society. 18. Officers. Organized to limit the need for officers. 19. Fad resistance. Organized to ignore or resist fads, and especially left-wing politically motivated fads. 20. Expansion. Organized to be able to rapidly expand the existing force in the event of war. 21. Frugality. Don't waste manpower and other resources. Let me give you a little thing on that. I saw a video once of the Indian Army's precision itty-bitty bicycle team. Now, the Indians can get away with that. They've got a very large population. They don't pay them very much. And they've got people to spare. Not a problem. For us, that would be criminal. 22. Compatibility. Organized so that everything fits together reasonably well. 23. Organize for leaders and staff to have a voice equal to their military value and organized to preserve two-way communication. Match responsibility. Ken, all that, Lawrence. 23. Politics. Organized for leaders and staff to have a voice equal to their military value and use. Organized to preserve two-way communication. Match responsibility to relative rank within the organization. Some considerations of organization. No one principle is dominant. 2. The principles can be and often are contradictory or even mutually exclusive. 3. There is no ideal organization. It is all compromise. 4. Good officers are of necessity rare, generally at or under 3% of total strength. 5. Bad officers do damage, even when they have good intentions and are personally good people. 6. The positive difference between 3% and the percent of officers you actually have are probably bad officers, however good their intentions. Also, note well, I'll explain those principles in a lot more depth after we have in the essay. For right now, we have a small history lesson. Historical example 1, the primitive mob. It's worth distinguishing between organizing for war and organizing for battle. They're different in many ways. Among these is that one typically organizes an entire society for war, but one organizes an army or a part of an army for battle. We're mostly concerned with the latter at this stage. Though it may be called an army, the primitive mob really isn't, nor does it organize to wage war. Instead, war is a game and battle is play. Not too serious play either. Mostly it's an opportunity for young men to show off under circumstances that are not very risky. It exists in a state British military historian John Keegan referred to as being below the military horizon. This was the form of battle among the Bantu tribes of southern Africa until the advent of Shaka, and it was also to be seen, at least until rather recently, among the primitive tribes of New Guinea. Although it had long-term aspects of survival or extinction, war was a game for the mob. Typically, they engaged in ambush and raid as a more or less continuing activity. Often the objective of the raid was to kill women and children, thus militarily disadvantaging the neighbors for the future. Stealing women, an important form of movable personal property of the day, was also highly regarded in many circles. There was, however, another kind of war our ancestral mobs engaged in, a more formal war, with something like declarations of war and the massing of, quote, armies, unquote. These, however, were laughable, with war still being more of a boys' game come sporting event, an exercise in showing manliness where the risks were minimal. Decisive action was impossible. Indeed, to have actually won the war would have ruined the future fun for everyone. There's a YouTube video you can find. Reading off the site to you would probably be a little difficult, but it's primitive war in New Guinea. And I recommend you look at it because it's probably most of human history right there. In any case, our distant ancestors, when it came to war, were fundamentally unserious. But then God, or at least the god of war, whispered into someone's ear, "Look, dumbass, if you can just get your friends and neighbors to march in step." Historical example 2, the Phalanx. The Phalanx, massed formation of spearmen, armored or at least bearing large shields, who marched in step and fought in close order, certainly didn't begin with the Greeks. We've got graphic evidence of Sumerian use of the Phalanx going back to the 25th century BC. And if you look up Phalanx on Wiki, you can find an illustration of a bunch of helmeted, shield-bearing men with spears marching forward in a big block. The Phalanx did take a large step forward with the Greeks, who added very heavy personal defenses to it in the form of bronze helmet, torso armor, greaves, a really heavy wooden shield, and coupled these to a culturally imbued attitude that demanded decisive action, close combat, and a fight to the finish. Against the Greek phalanx, a solid hedgehog of bronze armor and iron-tipped spears, more lightly organized, less disciplined, and less closely ordered foes rarely stood much of a chance. This was so despite the phalanx's many, many failings and weaknesses. What were those failings and weaknesses? It was slow and unwieldy. It depended on good order in the ranks, but was easily disordered, even broken up by rough terrain. The prime weapon, the thrusting spear, it was good against cavalry and other spears, but it wasn't much of a dueling instrument when facing a more highly maneuverable sword. The troops, being human, would push to the right as much to get as much of themselves behind their right-hand comrades' shields as possible, and that tended to drive the whole phalanx offside and to the right. Note, they made a virtue of this vice. Eventually, they came to rely on the effect to outflank their opponent, hopefully destroying his army by outflanking faster than their own was being destroyed. Note, the phalanx also didn't have much in the way of organization. The members of it might be united or grouped by tribe or by mess, as with the Spartans, or in some other basis, but the power and responsibilities of the leadership, such as it was, appear to have been highly limited. The whole thing was so simple to operate that not much in the way of organization was even useful. Even the Romans used the phalanx right up until its weaknesses were made manifest to them in a glaring and humiliating fashion. That was at the Battle of Caudine Forks, which wasn't really a battle. Historical example 3, the Macedonian phalanx. 2 battles rather shook the Greek reliance on their standard phalanx, fighting 8 ranks deep or 12 ranks deep. These were Delium of Socratic fame, by which I mean Socrates was there and was a hero as an old man, where Pagondus of Thebes massed his right flank 25 men deep to defeat the left flank of his Athenian opponents. And Leuctra, where Epaminondas, also of Thebes, regularized massing on one flank with the cream of his army and massing to the tune of 50 men deep. Philip of Macedon, held as a hostage at Thebes, had an excellent and close-up opportunity to study the military operations of Epaminondas. He took these lessons and applied them to his own kingdom's army upon his return to Macedon. The big differences Philip imposed included doubling the length of the phalanx to 16 ranks deep, which increased its endurance in the line of battle, dropping the 8 or so foot thrusting spear in favor of a pike of up to 20 feet in length, which allowed up to 5 ranks of spear points to be presented to the enemy, professionalizing the army, which allowed fairly complex maneuvers, and dumping most of the armor while decreasing the size and weight of the shield, both of which added speed at the cost of some personal security. In addition, Philip made his army a combined arms team, which included heavy cavalry, lighter cavalry, elite infantry, skirmishers, and other missile troops, and regular phalangists. Moreover, he subdivided the line into regiments composed of syntagmata, those being battalion blocks of 256 men, 16 by 16, under the command of a syntagmatarch. One suggests that the syntagmatarch was not in a position of mere prestige without much authority. The complex maneuvers of which the Macedonian phalanx was capable suggest a degree of independence in command and responsibility for training that was likely unique in the Hellenic world at the time. Note, however, that one thing the combined Macedonian army was not was simple. This tended to show up as weaknesses later on under the successors, Alexander's successors, as the various supporting arms were neglected or disbanded, leaving the phalanx rather vulnerable. And now I'm going to make a little willful digression into history. I'm skeptical of Hansen's theory on the physical push of the phalanx, and I'm skeptical for 4 reasons. One is that, facing a Roman legion, the physical pushing of massed ranks should have simply rolled over the Romans, who fought in a much more open order and could never have mustered sufficient counterpush to have held the line. The classical phalanx was so simple to train men to, and the vulnerability of the legion to physical pushing so complete, at least under Hansen's theory, that one would expect someone to have readopted the phalanx to face the legion. This never happened. But what about the pili, the Romans' heavy javelins? Wouldn't those stop the push? How'd they get through the Greek shields, frankly, which ran about 1.25 inches thick, I think? They're heavy. Secondly, you are what you were back then, as some shrink or social worker once said. The Macedonian phalanx, as previously mentioned, derived from the tactics of Pagondus at Delium and Epaminondas at, among other fields of battle, Leuctra. Completely abandoned any chance of physical pushing by massed ranks in favor of a lot of stabbing by massed pikes. That, if mass pushing had been routine previously, would represent a suspiciously revolutionary change. Moreover, the pikes weren't actually that strong. A classical hoplite phalanx, had it been using push, should have been able to physically break the pikes and then roll over the then disarmed, barely armored Macedonians. This also never happened. Thirdly, much of the evidence driving the belief in the pushing phalanx is based on the inexplicability of deepening ranks, massing combat power in other words, unless it was to physically push. There's an alternative explanation, though. The ancient battle tended to be won or lost at the rear via the mechanism of desertion. In other words, the side that ran last won. Battlefield desertion couldn't take place from the front, where to turn around was to die, to get a spear or sword in the back, or an arrow. Neither could it take place from the middle because there were people behind those men blocking escape. There was simply no way out. Rather, desertion, as mentioned, began from the rear, where the men couldn't see much, but they could hear a lot of screaming, smell perforated guts and spilled shit, choking on dust, and who existed in trembling terror for every step closer to the front they advanced. How to fix this? Simple. Make the phalanx deep enough that the rear ranks didn't have to worry about ever reaching the front until a decision had been reached. This would have kept the rear in place, hence the middle blocked from running, and of course the front still fighting. But I hear, but what about the Spartans? Surely they never ran or surrendered. Think so? Wrong. Check out the battles of Sphacteria in 425 BC and the Battle of Lechaeum in 391 BC. I'll spell Lechaeum for you. Lechaeum, and Sphacteria is Sphancteria. Finally, has anyone ever done a test to see if a standard bronze breastplate of the day could endure that kind of pressure without warping inward, suffocating its wearer? Was there any chance of the bronze replacement, the linothorax, layers of linen cloth held together by glue, holding out for a second against that kind of pressure? One is very, very skeptical. Example 4, the manipular legion. Never do an enemy a small injury. Now, that was the core of the advice from his father to a Sabine general called Gaius Pontius, following his entrapment of the Roman legion, just another phalanx at Caudine Forks. The details don't much matter of how the Romans found themselves boxed in a narrow, steep-walled canyon with a fortified and defended barrier to their front, and their Sabine enemy likewise in possession of the quickly barricaded pass behind them by which they'd entered the canyon. Suffice to say, they did find themselves in this most unfortunate and unenviable position. The phalanx was uniquely ill-suited, as I mentioned above, either to fight its, for rough terrain, which is to say in this case either to fight its way over the defended barriers and fortifications or to ascend the pass walls to either side. The nature of the ground would have instantly converted or reverted the phalanx back into a mob. Thus the Romans were stuck, facing starvation and forced to surrender. That's when Pontius, most unwisely, decided to do them a small injury. He made the entire army, consuls first, pass under the yoke in token of submission. Impelled by the humiliation, which could have gone a lot worse for them, a fact they were surely aware of, and possibly in imitation of the Sabine military practice of using small units to maneuver around about their rough terrain, the Romans dumped the phalanx in favor of a different formation. You can find a diagram of a Roman manipular legion easily online, so just do that. Make sure it's manipular, though. It's with the Roman manipular legion that we start to see a number of the principles of organization listed above in clear form. Before we get to that, though, a word or two of explanation is required. The blocks in the front rank, they were called the hastati, and they were the youngest heavy infantry in the legion. The hastati was composed of centuries which were paired to form maniples, what we would think of as platoons and companies. And even though they're called centuries, you think of 100, maddeningly enough, they were composed of 80 or 60. The second line, the princeps, behind the hastati and in the gaps between the maniples of hastati, were older men with a fair amount of experience in battle and on campaign. The last line, the triarii, were the oldest, grizzled veterans, experienced campaigners in their 40s and 50s. They were the least fit, but they were probably also the steadiest. All three classes were mostly armed the same way and armed at their own expense. That was an early form of graduated income tax, by the way. But the triarii, for quite a long time, retained the spear, echoing back to the legion's earlier days as a phalanx. I presume it was kept as a hedge, more or less a literal hedge, against a cavalry charge. Though it occasionally happened, you can look up the Battle of Kinos-Kephali for an example of where it did, the triarii very rarely had to fight. Instead, the bulk of their job was battlefield police, or that's what we call it today, stat and straggler control. In other words, they were there largely to prevent desertion from the rear of the engaged maniples. Remember what I said, how battles were lost and won earlier. And perhaps secondarily to ward off cavalry charges with their spears. We shouldn't presume, however, that the fear of being killed by the triarii was what actually motivated the hastati, and when their turn came to take point, the princeps, to fight. Instead, imagine something like this going on in the minds of the typical soldier of an engaged maniple. Quote, but I'm making this up. Dad and Uncle Marius are back there in the triarii maniple behind mine. Can't let them down or embarrass the family group. Gods, I'm afraid, though. I can hear the fighting up ahead. Was that just my friend Publius who screamed like his balls were cut off? What the fuck just went by? A spear? A javelin? Got no armor on my face. I'm worried about a javelin. I smell shit. Did someone crap themselves, or is there a punctured gut up ahead? Shit, Spurius on my right and Titus on my left look as terrified as I feel. What if they run? What if everybody runs and I'm left alone here to die uselessly, or get run down and stabbed in the back? I wish I could stop these shakes. Damn, is that Rufus they're carrying back? He's so pale. I had no idea human entrails were that color. The maniples, they're going to run. I can feel it. No, wait a second. They're not going to run because someone has to run first, while Dad and Uncle Marcus will kill that first deserter deader than Aunus and Seius, the Etruscans. They're not going to run because I know beyond a doubt they're dead if they do. Tartarus, everyone in the maniple knows that. So nobody's going to run. So what was I worried about? We'll stand and I won't get left to die alone. Life is good. I can hardly wait for my turn up at the front. End quote. Thing is, every soldier in an engaged maniple was probably thinking much the same thing. Thus, the confidence that no one would run became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that was how the Triarii kept men from deserting. Of course, I'd be terribly unsurprised if occasionally they did have to summarily execute this Brutus or that Drusus, but one doubts it was very common. Another feature of the manipular legion was that it was also essentially a reserve system, one where the loss of a legion, or say 16 of them, as at Cannae, meant relatively little except to weeping mothers. Plenty more where those came from. Moreover, as a reserve system, it was possible to rapidly expand the serving forces from the 4 Roman and 4 Allied legions of routine and peacetime to, well, they lost twice the number of their pre-war army in a single battle, Cannae 216 BC, and were still ready for more, ultimately having mobilized the equivalent of perhaps 90 or 100 legions, not simultaneously, over the course of the 17-year-long war. In any case, we can see at least 11 of those principles I mentioned in the manipular legion. How so? They've organized their units into a size that promotes social cohesion by making them no larger than would allow a man to know every other man, to care at least somewhat, and to value the good opinion of each and of the whole, and to be spoken well of. They've adopted a formation and tactical system that allows them to not only maneuver around man-made and natural obstacles without losing physical and moral cohesion, but also to take advantage of opportunities. They've organized with enough junior, even if aged, leadership to ensure training, discipline, and cohesion in the field. They had with the Velites, who were poorly equipped because poor, light infantry skirmishers and the cavalry, combined arms sufficient to their needs. They've got the Triarii to prevent desertion. The gaps allowed the maniples of the Hastati and Princeps to pass through each other, allowing rest. And the manipular officers, I'll get to that in a second, 1 per century, hence 2 per maniple, are responsible for training and leading an independent command, one of a size where their actions matter. Yeah, okay, officers. I don't think the centurions can really be called officers, certainly not at this point in time, and for the most part, not much later either. They come up from the ranks. They're not appointed. They're selected. They're from the same social class. They don't necessarily get a commission or get to keep their previous rank because of the peculiar way the Romans did things. So, no, I consider centurions to be very senior NCOs and the most junior rank of officer in the Roman legion to be a tribune. Okay, back to the legion. This whole thing is actually very simple to operate, from the march to the encampment to deploying for battle to engaging to pursuing. Moreover, with the bulk of them being heavy infantry and really only 3 MOSs, as we would think of them, with some additional skill identifiers and slaves for the scut work, there's no over-specialization. As mentioned, too, the system allows for mobilization from a massive base of reservists and militia. One has to ask why the opponents of Rome didn't penetrate into the gaps left between the maniples. The answer, I think, is that for some centuries most were afraid to try, that being a sort of voluntarily letting oneself be unflanked. Eventually, though, someone did. Historical example 5, the Marian Legion. The Marian Legion, the legions formed by the reforms of Gaius Marius, consuls I think 7 times, dispensed with independent maniples and instead formed the legion into 10 cohorts. 9 of those contained 6 centuries, forming 3 maniples each and numbered at full strength about 480. The first cohort, however, was different, having 5 centuries of 160 men, or about 800 in total. Nobody really knows why the Romans changed from the manipular legion to the Marian version. There's a lot of theories, none of which have ever struck me as especially persuasive, beyond that there was a shortage of manpower that could buy its own equipment because of a couple of disasters. Here are my best thoughts on the matter. If they don't persuade you, send me a list of those you like better. 1. I mentioned disasters. With the early losses to the Cimbri and the Teutons at Norea, Burdigala, and Arausio, possibly amounting to the equivalent of as many as 30 legions, or roughly 2 cannaes, there was a shortage of both trained manpower and, perhaps worse, centurions to train and lead any new troops who might be raised. 2. Shortages of manpower in the pertinent socio-economic classes, as alluded to. You had to be able to buy your own equipment to serve in the Roman army before Marius. Meant that the only source of replacements were the Roman and Italian poor who previously couldn't serve as heavy infantry. 3. The social and economic distance between the survivors of the battles mentioned above and the poor allowed men who might not have been a number one centurion material to serve as centurions, since they were still above the new rank and file and social class. However, 4, precisely because those men were not necessarily great centurion material, yet they had to be more closely supervised by those remnants who were. This was aided by the new organization, where 9 or 10 or 11 newly minted centurions could be placed under 1 or 2 or 3 in a cohort who knew what they were doing and could supervise and train them. 5, because unlike earlier armies fielded by Rome, these legions would stay together long term. They could be expected to have greater social cohesion than the old manipular legions, hence didn't really need triarii to keep them from deserting. 6, the gaps between maniples had to be left open to allow maneuver and prevent shocks from being transmitted across the line. They could be left open because civilized, sensible troops would hesitate to enter them, which would have exposed them to instant outflanking or, at best, being pelted with deadly missiles from 3 sides. The Teutons and Cimbri, however, were not civilized, neither were they especially sensible. They were the someones mentioned above who did. Indeed, they probably ignored the apparent risk, if it was even apparent to them, and charged right through. In the process, they could and would have outflanked, and, because maniples were small, obliterated the hastati more or less quickly, then turned in the princeps and then the triarii. Conversely, being 4 times bigger, Marian legions had bigger centuries again because centurion material had become in short supply. The cohorts of the Marian legions could not quickly be overwhelmed. They had staying power, in other words, the ability to soak up losses, and could even reorient their flanking centuries to keep from being outflanked. This last was probably aided by the newfound ability to drill professional troops numb. Although Caesar mentions that he preferred the Achaeus triplex, the triple line of battle based on the old manipular legions, he doesn't say why. They're unlikely to have served well as battlefield police as the old triarii did, because the spaces between cohorts were so much broader than the spaces between maniples and the older legion. In other words, there was just too big a gap to be covered to keep people in front from deserting. It may have had something to do with the ability to exploit a breakthrough. In any case, since the triarii as battlefield police were not needed, the Marian legion could simply cover a lot more frontage per man than the older legions could. The Marian legion was pretty much the ultimate in the ancient world. When Europe went through the Renaissance, part of the movement was the rediscovery of the ancient pike phalanx by the Swiss and German Landsknechte, while the Spanish adopted the tercio, a regiment of 3,000 men, to integrate the newly ascendant firearms. Still, one sees some echo of the old legion even there. Note here, folks, my daughter's cat has joined us for our little symposium, so any meowing and purring you hear is probably him. Okay, back to cases. Historical example 6, the corps d'armée. You should pardon the expression, but the really great leap forward came with the creation of the corps d'armée. We would say just the corps. Okay, so what was a corps? It was simply, 1, an all-arms formation, infantry, cavalry, artillery, and generally some engineers and support troops, that could be commanded by 1 man with the aid of a modest staff. That was 2. 3, of a sufficient size and depth that it could fight on its own, even against severe odds, and survive until help arrived, and was 4, capable of marching up a single road while finding enough to eat and subsist the horses on one side or the other road or the other. That lasted and worked fairly well most places. I'm unconvinced that the U.S. and C.S. armies in the Civil War ever really understood what a corps was supposed to be, not with the changes from corps to grand division and back again, as well as with the varying sizes. To me, the varying sizes appear to be, as much as anything, about the degree of confidence the Army commander felt he could place in a given corps commander, because you could find some corps twice the size of others. Right up to about 1914 it worked anyway. That's when something very interesting happened. See, the corps was still an all-arms formation that could be commanded by 1 man with the aid of a small staff, and which could fight independently for a period of time. It was not, however, capable of finding enough to eat, or, most critically, to feed the horses, which dragged its generally quite large and heavy artillery park. Thus, the key factor in corps size became that it could be no greater a size and form no lengthier column on the road than would allow wagons to move from the tail of the corps to the very point to resupply the men and horses. That size meant that every corps of the armies that really mattered in 1914 consisted of along with artillery, cavalry, engineers, and other supporting arms and branches, 2 divisions, each of 2 brigades, each of 2 regiments. The British Army was an exception to this, but it was fairly tiny on that scale of war. I'm sure that every army did most careful calculations to arrive at this form of organization. Said calculations no doubt aimed mathematically at maximizing both combat power and staying power. But there was a big problem. With only 2 divisions, the Corps commander had only a right and a left. That made maneuver extremely problematic. Yes, he could put 1 division forward and then try to maneuver with the other, but the enemy also had 2 divisions and would be doing exactly the same thing. In effect, under the totality of the circumstances, not least to include the density of troops on all sides in the West, every corps was a bludgeon and not much more. This, along with the breakdown of logistics, and especially logistics to support the horses, led directly to the stalemate and 4-year slaughterfest that started the process of ruining our civilization. Yeah, you think this organization crap isn't important? No, it's important. Okay, historical example 7, idiocy triumphant, the pentomic division. It's really difficult to do justice to the pentomic division. A major reason for this is that the division doesn't really deserve justice, but only a lynching. It was a horrible idea, an indictment of the General Officer Corps, the Officer Corps at large, the airborne community especially, the generals of which pushed this monstrosity, and the Army as a whole. It lasted less than 2 years, but did damage that the Army not only never has overcome, it never will either. In the first place, the pentomic division was intended to fight on the nuclear battlefield. That's where the tomic and pentomic comes in. To do this, the basic triangular infantry division was restructured away from 3 maneuver regiments, each of 3 maneuver battalions, each of 3 maneuver companies, each of 3 maneuver platoons, to 5 battle groups. These were a sort of intermediary organization between regiment and battalion. Battle groups, in turn, had 5 companies, each of 5 platoons. Thus, there were 81 platoons in the old division, but 125 in the new. This aspect mattered little. Generals usually aren't concerned with platoons. More importantly, there were 9 in the old battalion, 9 line platoons, plus specialty and support, but 25 in the new battle group, plus even more specialty and support. Note, too, that battle groups were generally commanded by colonels, just as regiments had been. It was pushed as forward thinking, but that was bullshit. The pentomic division actually harked back to the great artillery battles of World War I. The division wasn't intended to maneuver as such, but to endure via dispersion, huge, in this case nuclear bombardments, and then assemble to attack only frontally and through gaps created by our own nuclear deluging of the enemy. There's essentially nothing, no test, no field exercise, no credible body of theory to suggest that the pentomic division ever could have worked on the battlefield. That's only one of the reasons it was done away with. Remember, within 2 years, this thing was dead. There was another one. It was a personal and moral disaster. Go back a little bit to what I said on the number of platoons. What I grew up with for most of my time in the Army was called H-Series, and it was very similar to what preceded pentomic. An old-style H-Series battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel, had maybe 22 lieutenants that he senior-rated, 5 company execs, 9 line platoon leaders, 3 weapons platoon leaders, and 5 specialty platoon leaders, mortars, scouts, anti-tank, supply and transport, and medical. He has enough time to spend some time with each of them, maybe a dozen or more days and nights a year, with them or with their company close enough to see them, and that's enough to know them and to develop them. Moreover, his memory of being a lieutenant isn't all that old after all. He can still remember back 16 or 18 years. Conversely, the pentomic battle group commander, generally speaking a colonel, had, near as I can tell, 7 or 8 company execs, 25 line platoon leaders, 5 weapons, and at least 2 heavy mortar platoon leaders, still scouts, anti-tank, medical, and I think Davy Crockett nuclear recoilless rifles. In other words, the number of platoons that had leaders needing rating and mentoring doubled, even as the rank of the commander shot up to a level not notable for listening to and having patience with lieutenants, even if he'd had time and inclination, the former of which he most certainly did not. And that, friends, is how you get leadership that leads by demanding statistics, and followership that will eventually become leadership that survives by fudging statistics. Okay, I'm going to do another one of these probably in a month or so, and you'll be able to find it same time, same channel. You can get a very close written version of this on Bain.com. Just nose around or Google Organizing for War Kratman Bain, and you should find it.